Hey there, welcome to Quiet History Tonight. We're stepping into the long, brutal and fascinating history of medieval England. A world of kings, wars, castles, plague, faith and survival. From the fall of Roman rule to the rise of powerful kingdoms, this was a land shaped by conquest, hardship and constant uncertainty.
The last of the legions were a memory in the rain. They had marched down the straight grey roads, their bronze and iron glinting dully under a leaden sky. And then they were gone, leaving only the whisper of the wind through the empty gate. Now, a deeper quiet settled, a patient silence, broken only by the drip of water from broken tile and the soft scurry of creatures in the dark. Over the villa, the mist descended like a shroud, a gentle, persistent breath that blurred the sharp lines Rome had imposed upon the land. For decades, the stones remembered their purpose. The hypocaust held the ghost of warmth. The mosaic floors, though cracked and weed-veined, still hinted at distant seas and mythical beasts in their tesserae. But the forest had been listening at the edges, and now it began to whisper back. Ivy, thick as a man's wrist, crept over the low walls, a green living net drawing the masonry back to earth. Roots, delicate and insistent as fingers, probed the mortar, finding purchase in the slightest crack. In the spring, foxgloves and nettles stood tall in what was once the courtyard, their heads bowing. Under the weight of the rain, the seasons turned in a slow, silent wheel, and with each turn, the geometry of empire softened, absorbed into an older, more patient rhythm. The rain was the true conqueror. It fell in a ceaseless whispering curtain, finding every weakness. It pooled in the hollows of fallen roof tiles, turning them into tiny transient mirrors of the sky. It traced dark, weeping stains down plaster walls, leaching the color from frescoes of gods and gardens until they were mere shadows, faint smudges on the damp. The rain dissolved the straight road into mud, and the forest, emboldened, sent pioneers, a hawthorn here, a birch sapling there, to claim the air, open space. The land was breathing a sigh of relief, a long, slow exhalation of green. Generations of silence passed. Then, one autumn, a new smoke rose, not from the villa's cold hearth, but from a clearing, a bow shot away. It was a thin blue column smelling of oak and hearth cake. The settlers had come, not with trumpets or edicts, but with axes and patience. They were people of timber and thatch, their lives measured by the planting and the harvest, by the birth of calves and the depth of the winter snow. They built a hall, its great posts sunk deep into the forgiving earth, its roof a steep pitch to shed the everlasting rain. Its walls were of wattle and daub, warm and alive, echoing with the lowing of cattle at one end and the murmur of human voices at the other. From a distance, on a misty dusk, their settlement seemed a part of the forest itself, a natural growth. The light from their hearth fire bled softly through the open doorway, a fragile golden eye in the vast grey-green twilight. Their world was small, bounded by the known stream and the dark line of the wood where the old wolf still lived. They did not build for eternity, but for the turning year. Their stories were not of distant emperors, but of the local spirit in the waterfall, the hero buried in the barrow on the hill whose name they had already forgotten. The ruins watched, but now without jealousy. A shepherd boy, chasing a stray lamb, might clamber over the tumbled stones, his small hands touching the strange smooth cubes of the mosaic, feeling only cold and damp. To him, it was not a flaw, but a curious pattern laid down by the giant folk of old, a puzzle with no meaning. He would sit for a moment in the shell of the triclinium, listening to the rain drip, feeling the immense melancholy peace of the place before whistling for his dog and returning to the warm, smoky, alive world of the hall. The past was not dead, but sleeping, its dreams slowly becoming the soil from which the new world, with its own joys and sorrows, quietly grew. The rain continued to fall, binding it all together, the memory of stone and the promise of sap, the melancholy of loss and the gentle, relentless certainty of rebirth. The world, for the boy, was the hall. It was a kingdom of timber and shadow, a vast cave of warmth carved from the endless, whispering forest. Its high roof, lost in a gloom fragrant with wood smoke and drying herbs, was held aloft by great trunks of oak, their bark still rough in places, like the shoulders of sleeping giants. The walls were lined with woven hangings that stirred in the draught, their dyed walls depicting stags and ships and battles in shapes his half-dreaming mind could almost make move. But it was the beasts that held his gaze in the flickering hour. Carved where the crossbeams met the posts, their faces emerged from the grain. Twisted dragons with jaws agape, boars with gleaming amber eyes, serpents coiled in endless knots. In the steady light of day they were mere decoration, but now, at dusk, as the central fire sank to a pulsating heart of embers, they awoke. Firelight was their lifeblood. It flowed up the posts, licking at the carved creatures, making the dragons seem to swallow tongues of flame, causing the boar's tusks to gleam as if wet. Shadows pooled in the hollows of the knotwork, deep and liquid, then leaped across the wall as a log settled with a soft sigh in a shower of sparks. The boy, wrapped in a wool blanket near the hearth, watched this silent dance. His back was against a warm hound, its ribs rising and falling in a slow rhythm that matched his own. His eyelids were heavy, weighted with the day's play, and the dense, comforting air of the hall. The air had its own layers, a rich tapestry of smells that he knew as well as his mother's face. Underlying everything was the peat and oak smoke, a blue, earthy scent that clung to wool and hair. Over that lay the rich, greasy aroma of the evening stew, mutton and barley and wild leeks, still lingering from the bowl he had emptied. There was the tang of wet wool drying on lines strung near the roof, the sour note of the ale in the great wooden tankard passing among the men, and the clean, dry smell of the rushes strewn thickly on the floor, mingled with the mint and meadowsweet crushed underfoot. It was the smell of safety, of a whole world contained under one long roof, holding back the vast damp cold of the Northumbrian night. From the shadows at the hall's far end, beyond the fire's direct reach, a sound began to weave itself into the tapestry. It was the scop, his old fingers gentle on the lyre's strings. The notes were not a tune for dancing, but a soft rippling undercurrent, like water over stones in the dark. Then his voice joined it, a low, weathered murmur that seemed less to travel through the air than to grow from the very soil of the floor. He sang not of now, but of then. He sang of a hero standing alone on the shore, watching a beast rise from the mere, its scales gleaming with a pale, deathly light. The words were strange, formal, a chain of names and deeds, but the rhythm was the familiar rhythm of the sea on shingle, of a heartbeat in the chest. The boy did not follow the story. The meaning was less important than the sound, the deep resonant hum that vibrated in the timber of the hall, making the post at his back feel alive. He heard the clash of iron, but it was a distant, softened clash, like stones rolling in a far-off wave. He heard the grief of lords, but it was a noble, golden sadness, beautiful in its distance. The Scop's song was a spell, weaving a wall of memory and glory around the firelight, holding the present night and all its fragile warmth safe within a circle of older, greater things. The child's breathing slowed, sinking with the cadence. The firelight on the carved dragon became a blur of gold and black. The smells of stew and smoke merged into a single warm presence. The hall, the kingdom of Mercia or Northumbria, the whole world of earth and oak, seemed to draw in around the hearth, a small bright island in a sea of time and forest. His eyes closed fully, not in sleep, but in a lulled, waking dream where the hero's journey and the crackle of the fire were one and the same, where the past was not a foreign country, but a deeper layer of the same, safe, dark, and the soft song of the Scop was the voice of the hall itself, singing its people, and one small boy, into the safety of the night. The new faith arrived not with a clap of thunder, but with the quiet, persistent rhythm of a chanted prayer. It seeped into the land like morning mist, softening the edges of the old gods, weaving its stories into the existing tapestry of hill and stream. In a river loop, where the land rose gently from the water meadows, a settlement of stone and prayer had taken root. Its name was a whisper of Latin on the Saxon tongue, a fragile outpost of a different eternity. At dawn, the world here held its breath. The sky was a wash of pearl and dove grey, the last stars fading like distant watchfires. A low, clinging dew silvered the grass of the cloister garth and beaded on the spiderweb strung between the wooden frames of the vegetable patches. From the small square church, a sound began, a low unison murmur that seemed to vibrate from the very stones. It was the office, the daily sanctification of the hours. A human breath offered to the silence. Inside the church, the air was cool and still, carrying the scent of cold stone and the faint honeyed perfume of beeswax from a single candle on the altar. The monks stood in their stalls, shadows within shadows, their hoods drawn up. Their chant was a river of sound, plain song flowing in a steady, undulating current. There were no harmonies, only this single woven thread of melody, rising and falling with a calm certainty that felt as ancient as the river outside. The Latin words were shapes in the air, their meaning perhaps secondary to their rhythm, a rhythmic anchor in the vast quiet morning. The sound did not echo, but was absorbed by the thick walls and the thatch above, a contained and private offering. Through the small high window, a sliver of the brightening sky cast a pale blade of light across the packed earth floor, illuminating motes of dust that turned slowly in the sacred sonorous air. As the sun climbed, the monastic day unfolded with the ordered pace of a liturgy. In the scriptorium, a room whitewashed to capture every scrap of light, another kind of prayer was in progress. Here, the silence was profound, broken only by the soft, rhythmic scratch of a quill and the occasional, almost imperceptible sigh of a man shifting on his wooden stool. The air smelled of parchment and ink, of the faint animal tang of vellum and the sharper mineral scent of ground gallnuts and iron. A monk, his back to the small window, bent over a sloping desk. Before him lay a page of unimaginable potential, a sheet of creamy vellum, stretched and scraped to a smooth, supple skin. His hand moved with a slow, deliberate care, the brown ink flowing from the nib of his goose-feather quill to form the precise rounded letters of the insular minuscule script. Each curve was a measured gesture, each liner packed with permanence. This was not writing. It was inscription, a physical planting of the word into the very fibre of a once living thing. But the true magic, the slow, painstaking alchemy, was reserved for the great letters that would begin a gospel. A page lay nearby, its central character, a huge, ornate C for Christus, already outlined in fine, dry point. Now came the illumination. With a finer brush made from a single squirrel hair, the monk began to lay down colour. He worked from small pots of pigment ground from stones and plants, mixed with egg white. A vibrant, leafy green filled a tendril. A lapis lazuli blue, precious as a jewel, pooled in a curving panel. He leaned closer. His breath stilled as he applied tiny dots of white lead to suggest a dewdrop on a painted berry, or a highlight on the beak of a bird woven into the letter's form. The work was achingly slow. A day might pass in the filling of a single, intricate knot. His world had shrunk to the space of his palm, to the dance of light on liquid colour, to the patient subjugation of his own will to the demands of the pattern. It was a meditation in pigment, a silent hymn made visible. Outside, the mundane and the sacred met in the peace of the vegetable gardens. Monks in mud-stained habits moved between the ordered rows, their hands tending leeks, cabbages and woad with the same reverence they brought to the psalter. Bees hummed in the herb garden, where thyme and rosemary spilled over wattle edgings. The peace was not an empty silence, but a full one, woven from the scratch of the quill inside, the distant chop of a hoe in the soil, the murmur of the river beyond the wall, and the slow, patient turning of the sun across the sky. Here, in this enclosed world of stone and vellum, chant and cultivation, a new kind of kingdom was being built, one not measured in hides of land or the loyalty of Thesians, but in the careful copying of a sentence, the growth of a bean shoot, and the quiet, at hermit D's unwavering belief that both were threads in the same divine tapestry. The faith was spreading, not as fire spreads, but as ink soaks into a page, transforming it from within. One deliberate, beautiful stroke at a time. The river that summer morning wore a cloak of mist. A soft, white breath exhaled from the water, and the water meadows blurring the line between sky and stream. It was a morning of profound stillness, the kind that holds its breath before a sigh. In the village nestled in a bend of the river, life stirred with the gentle predictability of habit. Smoke, thin and blue as a forget-me-not, curled from the roof holes of the timbered huts. The low, contented grunt of a pig rooting in the common ground carried through the damp air. A woman knelt by the water's edge, beating linen against a smooth stone. The rhythmic thump, a soft domestic drumbeat in the silence. The world was at peace, wrapped in a familiar drowsy security. The forest at its back a dark, known friend. From the east, where the river widened to meet the grey sea, the mist was thicker, a luminous wall that swallowed sound and distance. And then, within that wall, a shape coalesced. It was a mere suggestion at first, a darker grey against a pearl, a long, low shadow that seemed to glide without movement. As it drew nearer, the suggestion hardened into form. The prow emerged first, a sinuous curve of carved oak rising from the mist like the neck of some primordial water beast. It was a dragon prow, its snarling muzzle open in a silent roar. Its eyes blank, weathered sockets that had stared down 1,000 waves. The morning light, still weak and diffused, caught a glint of ancient paint on a scaled cheek, a flash of faded red, a hint of yellowed tooth, before the mist swirled back, half concealing it again. It was an image of distant ominous beauty, a carved nightmare arriving in utter silence. Behind the first, a second shape appeared, then a third. The dragon ships moved with a ghostly grace, their long, sleek hulls cutting the placid river water without a ripple, their single square sails furled tight to the yards. No drumbeat paced their oars. The oars themselves were shipped, resting inside the gunwales. The men within were shadows, their forms blurred by the haze, their helmets and spear points catching dull gleams of the filtered light. Men within were shadows and blurred by the haze, their helmets and spear points catching dull. Men within in spear points catching dull. Gly, men within the filtered light. They were as still as the carvings on their prow, their faces turned toward the sleeping village. Their approach was not an assault, but an eerie, patient drift. A predator's stalk where the only sound was the faint creak of seasoned timber and the occasional soft drip of water from a blade. They were a phantom fleet, emerging not from the sea, but from the realm of myth and bad dream, materializing in the heart of a peaceful morning. In the village, the rhythm of the day held. A child chased a goose, his laughter bright and sharp in the moist air. The woman at the riverbank paused, lifting her head as if hearing a distant bird call, then resumed her work, the thump of wet linen steady and reassuring. They did not see the shapes in the mist. Their world was the circle of cleared land. The smell of baking bread beginning to mix with the wood smoke, the solid, known presence of the palisade gate standing open to the morning. The stillness was a blanket they trusted, woven from generations of such mornings. The dragon prows were now fully visible from the riverbank, monstrous and beautiful, their carved heads seeming to sniff the air for the scent of hearth and harvest. But the village, wrapped in its own tiny reality, remained oblivious. remained oblivious, a picture of pastoral innocence framed by the rising mist. The ships grounded their keels on the soft mud of the bank. With a soft sighing crunch, a sound no louder than a deer stepping on a twig, the shadows within them moved, then flowing over the sides with a practiced liquid ease, their feet sinking into the mud. For a long suspended moment, they stood at the tree line, a line of tall, armed men between the forest and the fields, watching. Then, as if at a silent signal, they began to walk, not with a charge, but with a deliberate, spreading advance, like ink soaking into parchment. The first thread of smoke appeared not from a thatched roof, but from a storehouse at the village edge, a thin grey tendril that quickly fattened into a dark, billowing column. Other smokes followed, rising straight up in the windless air. There was no scream yet, no clamour of alarm, only this sudden silent flowering of dark blooms against the pale sky. From a far hill, a shepherd, old and bent with seasons, paused in his slow tracking of his flock. He turned, his hand shading his eyes against the growing light. He saw the village, a tiny cluster of roofs in the grey-green lap of the valley. He saw the river, a silver thread, and he saw the new black columns of smoke rising, not from hearths but from homes, climbing slowly, relentlessly, to stain the pristine morning sky. The distance swallowed all sound. The scene was a silent tableau of calamity. He stood, a solitary figure against the vast sky, his crook held loose in his hand, watching the peaceful proof of his world's vulnerability paint the air. The mist was burning away now, revealing a day that was no longer gentle, but stark and clear, and changed forever. The dragon ships had appeared, and in their silent wake they left only a distant, rising smoke, a quiet signal of an ending, seen from a far hill where the only sound was the indifferent whisper of the wind through the grass. The flame was a small, defiant kingdom. It burned in a pool of molten wax at the base of a tallow candle, its light a fragile, golden sphere that pushed back the pressing weight of the night. Beyond its reach, the fortress room was a cavern of shadows, its timber walls absorbing the glow, its corners lost in a deep, velvety blackness that smelled of damp earth and cold stone. Within the sphere sat a man, his form hunched over a wooden table, his face a landscape of concentration carved by the flickering light. This was Alfred, King of the West Saxons, though in this silent hour he wore his kingship like a simple heavy cloak. The wall of that cloak, a thick, undyed grey, was rough under his fingers as he adjusted it against the chill. Its texture spoke of practicality, of sheep pastures and busy looms, a world of humble, essential things that now formed the last bulwark against the storm that had consumed so much of his world. His hands, resting on the vellum pages before him, were not the soft hands of a scholar prince. They were marked by the grip of a sword, calloused from the reins of a horse, yet now they lay still, one finger tracing the elegant foreign curves of Latin script. The book was a treasure more vital than any hoard of arm rings, a thread connecting this damp, besieged corner of Wessex to the vast, luminous world of learning that the Viking storm seemed determined to extinguish. He could read the words, slowly, painstakingly, his lips forming the unfamiliar syllables without sound. Each sentence was a fortress to be taken, each paragraph a campaign requiring patience and resolve. The candlelight gleamed on the ink, making the letters seem to shift and dance. A coded message from a civilization of reason and faith. A civilization he was desperate to remember and rebuild. The flame flickered. A sudden, frantic dance as a draft, the cold breath of the wider darkness, found its way through the chinks in the daub and wattle wall. Alfred's shadow leaped grotesquely against the timber behind him, a giant form that shrank back to a man's size as the flame steadied. He did not look up. His gaze remained fixed on the page, on the orderly lines of thought that stood in such stark contrast to the chaotic, brutal year just past. In the quiet, his mind could not help but wander the well-trodden paths of memory, not as a king reviews a strategy, but as a man revisits a series of wounds. He remembered the desperate, nomadic years moving from one temporary refuge to another, the crown a burden of lead, his people scattered like leaves before the autumn gale of the great heathen army. He recalled the taste of defeat, not as a bitter gall, but as a cold, hollow emptiness in the belly, a feeling of the very earth dissolving beneath his feet. The struggles were not grand battles in his recollection, but a mosaic of smaller, sharper miseries. The sight of a burned monastery, its gospel pages ash. The burned monastery, its gospel pages ash. Sound of women weeping in the frosty reeds of the marshes. The relentless, grinding anxiety that was the constant companion of a king who could not guarantee the dawn. Yet, here was the dawn, or at least this small handmade sun upon the table. His resolve had not been a sudden, blazing inspiration, but a slow, stubborn kindling, like coaxing a fire from damp tinder. It had been born in the humility of those marsh-bound days, in the understanding that swords alone were not enough. A kingdom could be defended with walls and warriors, but it could only be built with law, with faith, with the shared memory of what it meant to be a people. The Latin text before him was a tool for that building, to translate, to learn, to teach. This was his new warfare. The quiet determination that settled upon his features in the candlelight was the same that had held a shield wall, but turned inward, focused on a more profound and lasting line of defense. He would be a king of the book as well as the sword, a guardian of the flame in every sense. The darkness outside was real, a tangible presence of threat and despair. But here, in this sphere of warm light, with the whisper of ancient wisdom beneath his fingers and the rough, honest wool of his cloak about his shoulders, Alfred the Great tended his tiny essential kingdom, one careful word at a time, a solitary man preparing, in the deepest quiet of the night, to rekindle a world. Dawn came not as a victory, but as a quiet exhale. Over the field where men had clashed the day before, a low silver mist clung to the earth, softening every contour, blurring the harsh lines of the recent past. The grass, trampled by thousands of feet, lay flattened in swirling patterns, each blade bent under the weight of dew. The moisture collected in the hollows left by heels and knees, forming tiny, perfect mirrors that reflected the pearly sky. Here and there, A darker patch stained the green, a rust-brown bloom where iron had bitten the earth. But the mist softened these too, making them seem like shadows of old bruises, already fading. The air was cold and clean, carrying the scent of wet soil, crushed mint, and a faint, distant wood smoke. It was the smell of a world washed and still, holding its breath. The field sloped gently toward a shallow river, its course marked by a thicker ribbon of mist. On a low rise, a large tent of faded canvas had been erected, its guy ropes taut, its entrance flaps tied back. From this distance it was a silent grey shape, but around it movement was slow and purposeful. Men, small as figurines from this remove, moved between cooking fires, their breath pluming in the chill. The sounds that carried across the field were not the clang of arms, but the mundane music of a camp at dawn, the chop of an axe splitting kindling, the low murmur of conversation, the occasional whicker of a horse. The tension of the previous day had dissolved, replaced by a weary, watchful calm. The pivotal moment had passed. Now came the long, careful work of what came after. Inside that distant tent, unseen, but felt in the very atmosphere of the morning, a treaty was being discussed. It was not the stuff of song, this negotiation. It was a practical, grinding affair of terms and guarantees, of hostages and boundaries, spoken in halting Latin and the guttural tones of the Norse tongue, translated by weary priests. The words themselves were less important than the fact they were being spoken at all. That two sides, after years of fire and blood, now sat across a table, measuring their futures not in spear lengths, but in promises. The peace being forged was fragile, a thin blade of understanding that would require constant polishing, but it was a beginning. The mist outside seemed to seep into the very concept, blurring the hard edges of enemy, making a new, uncertain shape possible. The emphasis of the day was on this slow reclamation. Already, on the far edges of the field, parties of men were at work, not with weapons, but with tools. They were gathering the debris of battle, a somber harvest. Broken shield bosses, splintered spear halves, and torn cloaks were piled for burning or burial. It was methodical, respectful work, a ritual of cleansing. Other groups moved with surveying poles, their eyes measuring the lie of the land, pointing toward the river ford or the old trackway. They were the king's engineers, their minds already turning from the tactics of battle to the strategy of permanence. The discussion in the tent would grant a space of peace, and into that space they would pour stone and timber and law. For this was the true work now. The building of burhs, not just forts, but fortified towns, places of market and moot as much as garrison. In the mind's eye, one could see them rising, these islands of order in a still troubled land. The ditches would be dug deep, the banks thrown high and palisaded. Within, streets would be laid out with a ruler's straightness, plots allotted for granaries, for a mint, for a church. They would be seeds planted in the wounded earth, each one a nucleus of safety and commerce, a tangible promise that the king's peace was not merely an absence of war, but a presence of something better. It was the slow, unglamorous labor of cobblestones and charters, of appointed reeves and standardized weights, of ensuring that a man's journey from one burh to the next was protected by the king's writ, not just his own strength. The mist began to thin as the sun gained strength, turning from silver to gold. The dew on the trampled grass sparkled, a field of transient diamonds. The distant sound from the tent was now a low, steady murmur. Like the river itself, the peace regained was not a return to what was before, for that was lost forever in the smoke of burned halls. It was something new, harder won and more deliberate. It was a kingdom being built, not on the shifting sands of heroism, but on the solid, slow-setting mortar of law, of wall, of collective breath, held and then slowly, carefully released. The flame that had been guarded in the darkness of a fortress room was now a small, steady fire in the hearth at the center of a newly planned town, its light promising not just warmth, but a future measured in seasons of growth, not seasons of fear. On that misty field, amidst the dew and the quiet industry, the dream of a realm that could endure was, at last, beginning to take root in the earth. A silver penny, newly struck, lay cool and heavy in a merchant's palm. Its face bore the stern, bearded profile of a king, a circlet upon his brow, the name Alared ringing him in runic letters. The reverse showed a cross pate, solid and unshakable. It was a tiny, perfect disk of order, a covenant between the crown and the realm. The merchant's hand, calloused from hemp rope and salt, closed around it, feeling its reassuring weight. This small circle of metal was the pulse of the later Anglo-Saxon world. This small circle of metal was the pulse of the later Anglo-Saxon world. A world that had grown from timber into stone, from isolated halls into a network of trade and prayer, and it passed from hand to hand through the gentle clamour of a bustling port like Winchester. The air in the market street was a rich tapestry of smells, woven with the sharp, briny tang of the sea and the distant, exotic perfume of spices, unloaded from Frisian cogs, pepper and cinnamon. Smells of lands beyond the Whale Road. It mixed with the homely scent of baking bread, of smoked fish, of the earthy odour of woolens and the sharp reek of the tanning yards from the river's edge. The clamour was a music of prosperity, the rhythmic thump of a cooper driving hoops onto a barrel, the grating song of a grindstone, sharpening a blade, the murmur of 100 transactions in a babble of English, Norse, and broken Latin. Stall awnings of faded canvas flapped in the river breeze, shading bolts of Flemish cloth, glazed pottery, and iron tools. People moved with a purposeful ease, their clothes of good, dyed wool, their belts fastened with simple bronze buckles. Fastened with simple bronze buckles. The fear of the dragon ships was a generation old, a ghost story for winter nights. Now the ships that nosed up the Etchen brought wool, tin, and gossip, not fire. The penny left the merchant's hand for a wool wife's, payment for a cloak of fine grey weave. Her fingers, stained with woad, counted it instinctively before it dropped into a leather purse at her waist. From there, it passed to a baker for a dozen loaves, then to a franklin settling a tithe. With each transaction, the coin grew warmer, absorbing the life of the town. It was a symbol of a stable reign, of laws that held and roads that were safe, of mints that produced honest weight and kings who for a time held the balance. Its journey mirrored the connections knitting the land together, from the sheep-dotted downs to the busy wharves. And everywhere there was stone, not the melancholy, rain-soaked stone of the old ruins, but new, purposeful stone. It rose in the arches of churches, their walls thick and whitewashed, their towers squat and strong. The timber of the great halls was now often complemented by a stone chapel, a private chantry where a Thegner's family could pray. In the Minster church, the air was cool and still, smelling of incense and damp masonry. Light fell through narrow windows onto painted walls, illuminating saints with calm, wide eyes. The very solidity of these buildings spoke of permanence, of a faith and a social order that had put down deep roots. The stone was a reply to the old, transient world of oak and thatch. It was a statement meant to endure. The penny's final journey in this age was a quiet one. It travelled in a tax collector's chest, part of the Heerregeld to pay for peace or for ships, a necessary compromise in a world still watchful. Eventually, it might be melted down, its silver reused, its image lost. But the order it represented found its purest expression not in Winchester's bustle, but further east on a soggy island in the Thames. Here in the closing years of the age rose Westminster. King Edward, called the Confessor, a man of more prayer than policy, had dreamed of a great church, and so it grew, a vast skeleton of stone in the marsh, its outlines foreign and grand, more Romanesque than Saxon. The quiet here was profound, broken by the distant calls of masons, and the endless rush of the river. It was a place of immense, aspiring stillness, a sanctuary of stone, built by a king whose gaze seemed fixed more on heaven than on his kingdom. The interior, when finished, would be a forest of columns, a shadowy, echoing space waiting for a history it could not yet imagine. The silver penny's world of gentle commerce and sturdy local faith was culminating in this serene, monumental withdrawal. The Confessor's Westminster stood as a beautiful, fragile coda, a testament to the spiritual heights the Anglo-Saxon realm could reach, and a silent stone invitation to whatever or whoever might come next. The sea trade continued, the markets hummed, the penny still passed from hand to hand. But here, on the river's edge, the age was ending not with a roar, but in the quiet, cool, expectant silence of a nearly empty nave. The comet arrived as a silent rent in the fabric of the night. In a village nestled in the Sussex Downs, an old shepherd, unable to sleep, stood in the damp grass of the common and watched it. It hung in the eastern sky, a luminous brushstroke of frost fire, its core a smudge of cold light and its tail a vast ethereal veil drawn across the stars. It moved with an imperceptible, stately grace, a visitor from the black gulfs beyond the moon, and its light was not the warm, flickering light of hearth or torch, but a pale, spectral glow that seemed to leach colour from the world below. The shepherd's breath plumed in the January air, but he did not feel the cold. He felt only the immense, soundless pressure of the sign. The village around him slept. The thatched roofs humped like sleeping beasts under the Milky Way, but the sky was awake, and it was speaking in a language older than Latin or English. The comet's beauty was portentous, a serene and terrible adornment to the vault of heaven, and its silence was more frightening than any thunder. News that year travelled like a change in the wind. It came not with heralds on lathered horses, but in the murmurs of peddlers at crossroads, in the lowered voices of monks passing through, in the anxious glances exchanged between thieves after church. Word reached the village that the old king, Edward the Confessor, was dead. His saintly gaze finally turned fully heavenward, and with his last breath, the delicate peace of the realm had exhaled into uncertainty. It was whispered that the Witan had chosen Harold Godwinson, the Earl with the quick smile and the firm hand, to wear the crown. The villagers, gathered at the well, spoke of this with cautious hope. Harold was a man of the land, a warrior who had fought Vikings and kept the Welsh marches quiet. His accession felt like a natural succession, the strong arm of a brother taking the helm. They imagined him in the great new hall at Westminster, a solid Saxon king for a solid Saxon land. The spring came on, green and tender, and for a moment the comet's warning seemed a distant, fading memory. But other whispers rode the sea mists. From the south, carried by fishermen who dared the channel, came tales of a gathering in Normandy. Duke William, they said, was a man of iron will and a long memory. He claimed a promise, sworn on holy relics, that the crown was his. In his court at Rouen, the talk was not of planting, but of building. The whispers described not armies mustering, but forests falling. Great trees were hewn and dragged to the coast, their trunks shaped into the skeletons of transport ships. Forges along the Seine glowed day and night, their hammers beating a relentless rhythm on iron, turning out chainmail by the cartload. The news painted a picture, not of chaotic rage, but of meticulous, terrifying industry. It was the sound of a vast, patient machine being assembled, cog by cog, nail by nail, across the narrow sea, and the village men sharpened their own billhooks and scythes with a new, thoughtful intensity, the rhythmic scrape of wet stone on steel, a small local echo of that distant, ominous preparation. The mood through the spring and into the high summer was one of serene, inevitable change, like the slow, inevitable turning of the seasons themselves. The comet was gone, but its passage had left a subtle alteration in the air, a sense of a page waiting to be turned. Life in the village continued its ancient round, the ploughing, the sowing, the blessing of the fields, but each action now felt weighted, each sunset more poignant. The hay was cut under a wide blue sky and gathered into sweet-smelling ricks. Children played in the meadows, their laughter bright and fleeting. Women weeded the vegetable patches, their hands dark with soil. Yet, in the quiet moments, eyes would turn south, towards the downs that rolled to the white cliffs. The sea was a constant, murmuring presence, and now it seemed to murmur of more than fish and weather. It carried the scent of a different future, one being hammered and stitched together on a foreign shore. The serenity was not ignorance, but a deep, communal breath held, a calm acknowledgement that the world they knew was balanced on a knife edge, and that the winds, when they shifted, would come from the south. The land itself seemed to wait, heavy with grain and history. Under the broad, watchful sky, dawn on Senlac Hill was a slow unveiling in shades of grey. A thick, wet mist had risen from the marsh at the hill's foot, swallowing the lower slopes and blurring the world into a soft, formless void. The crest of the ridge was an island in this sea of vapour, its outline barely discernible against the lightening sky. The air was cold and heavy, carrying the smell of damp earth, crushed grass, and the faint metallic scent of fear held in check. On that island, shapes began to solidify as the light grew. Not yet men, but darker masses against the sand. Grey, a long, bristling line that followed the curve of the hill. It was the English shield wall, a rampart of oak and iron and human resolve, waiting in a silence so profound it seemed to absorb the very breath of the morning. From within the mist below, sounds emerged, muffled and distorted as if heard through wool. There was the soft, rhythmic clink of mail, the creak of leather, the occasional snort of a horse, quickly hushed. A low murmur of voices, speaking in a tongue that was not English, rose and fell like the murmur of a distant stream. Now and then, a sharper sound pierced the haze. The ring of a hammer on a rivet, a curt order, the metallic scrape of a blade being drawn slowly from a scabbard. These were the sounds of an army preparing in the blind, a vast hidden organism coiling itself at the foot of the slope. The Normans were down there, thousands of them. But the mist rendered them phantoms. Their presence felt only in these disembodied whispers of industry and intent. The English on the hill could see nothing but the shifting, pearly wall below them, making the waiting an exercise in imagination, each man painting his own dread or defiance onto the blank canvas of the fog. As the sun, a pale, watery disk, began to burn through the upper layers of mist, movement started within the blur. It was not the ordered advance of legend, but a slow, chaotic seething, like dark water beginning to boil. Shapes coalesced and dissolved, the gleam of a conical helmet, the bulk of a horse, the long, thin shadow of a lance. The mist thinned in patches, revealing brief, disconnected tableaux, a line of crossbowmen winding their weapons, their movements methodical and calm. A priest holding a reliquary aloft, his mouth moving in silent prayer. A knight swinging himself into the saddle, his surcoat a splash of colour against the grey. Then the haze would close again, swallowing the scene, leaving only the impression of relentless, hidden motion. The air began to thrum with a new sound, a deep, polyphonic hum, the murmur of many prayers, the nervous jingle of harness, the rustling of thousands of men, shifting their weight from foot to foot, all blending into a single, ominous note that vibrated in the damp air. Then, with a suddenness that was almost shocking, the mist tore. A gust of wind from the channel swept up the slope, ripping the veil aside for a moment, revealing the full, terrible geometry of the day. The Norman host was arrayed in 3 great blocks on the lower ground, a tapestry of colour and steel. But the distance and the still swirling tendrils of vapour softened the details, turning the charge that began not into a spectacle of individual heroism, but into a blur of collective movement. The cavalry advanced first, a wave of dark shapes flowing up the green slope, their speed deceptive in the haze, seeming slow then impossibly fast. The crash, when it came, was not a single sound but a prolonged grinding roar, the thunder of hooves, the splintering of shields, the collective shout of impact, all blended by the hill's remove into a single brutal exhalation. Arrows rose from below in whispering flocks, appearing from the mist to darken the sky before falling into the English lines with a sound like sudden heavy rain on autumn leaves. The battle, seen from this atmospheric distance, was not a series of duels but a slow, chaotic churning on the hillside. A great beast of conflict writhing in the mud and the thinning fog, its details mercifully lost, its essence a raw, elemental struggle for the high ground. The sun climbed, pale and indifferent, burning away the last of the mist to reveal a scene of stark, mud-churned clarity. The struggle continued, a weary, grinding stalemate of push and counter-push, the hill slope now littered with dark, still shapes. As the long afternoon waned, the movement slowed, the shouts grew hoarser, the tide of battle, shifting with a fatal, gradual inevitability. And then, as the sun began to sink behind the English line, painting the scene in long, tragic shadows of amber and rust, the final act played out. A feigned retreat, a fatal breaking of the wall, a sudden decisive collapse inward. The sounds of combat faded, replaced by a lower, grimmer noise of pursuit and finality. Evening fell, a quiet so deep it felt like a physical presence after the day's roar. The last light bled from the sky, leaving Senlac Hill a dark silhouette against a bruised purple horizon. Down in the marsh, the mist began to reform, creeping back over the field, gently covering what lay there. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, shocked into silence. A cold, clean wind stirred, carrying away the smells of iron and sweat, bringing instead the scent of damp soil and distant sea. Stars pricked the vast darkening vault. On the hill, a few scattered fires flickered where the victors camped, tiny, lonely points of light in an immense darkness. The battle was over. The kingdom had changed hands, and over the quiet fields and woods of Sussex, over the whole sleeping, conquered land, a new and profound silence descended. The silence of an era ending, of a world settling heavily and forever into a different shape. Under the cold, watchful eyes of the stars, from the raw timber platform of the new motte, the conquered land lay spread like a subdued beast. William, King of England, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, a still, dark figure against a sky the colour of wet slate. The air was cold and carried the scent of turned earth, wood smoke, and the distant, damp decay of autumn leaves. Below him, in the bailey, the sounds of Norman industry were sharp and purposeful, the rhythmic chop of axes shaping palisade stakes, the grating drag of a sled loaded with stone, the guttural commands of sergeants drilling men in the muddy yard. But up here, on this artificial hill of packed soil and turf, there was a hollow quiet, broken only by the sigh of the wind in the newly planted standard above his head. The geometry of his power was stark against the old soft landscape. The motte was a perfect brutal cone, its slopes still bare and raw, where grass had yet to take hold, a deliberate scar upon the gentle roll of the countryside. From its apex, his gaze swept over a patchwork that was now his, to inventory and control. A burning tarn, his gaze swept over a patchwork that was now his, to inventory and control. To the west, the ancient forest was a rumpled, dark green blanket, its edges now being methodically pushed back by his foresters, the straight lines of their new facades cutting into the organic blur of the woodland like knife cuts. To the east, the Saxon fields lay in their familiar, irregular strips, following the curves of stream and slope, but they were now punctuated by the blackened squares of burned-out hamlets, deliberate lessons in charcoal and ash. The contrast was the story of his reign. The new, severe lines of control imposed upon the old, patient patterns of life. The land itself seemed to hold its breath under this new surveying gaze, waiting to be measured, catalogued, and assigned. His shadow, cast long by the low afternoon sun, stretched down the moat slope, a thin, elongated finger pointing toward the nearest village. It was a shadow that now fell across every hearth in England. The quiet, relentless work that truly extended. That shadow was not done by soldiers, however, but by clerks. In his mind's eye, he saw them, fanning out like well-disciplined, secular monks, into every hundred and shire. They worked in the chilly halls of appropriated manors, at trestle tables spread with parchment, their pens scratching in a silence as profound as any scriptorium's. This was the Doomsday Survey, an inquisition more comprehensive than any battle. They asked their questions with calm, implacable precision. How many hides? How many ploughs? How many men, free and unfree? How much woodland, pasture, meadow? What was it worth then? What is it worth now? The questions were a net thrown over the sleeping land, designed to leave nothing unaccounted for. In each village, the Saxon elders were gathered, made to testify under oath about the very bones and sinews of their own world. They spoke of mill sites and fisheries, of the yield of a particular field, of the number of pigs that could forage in a given wood. Their words, often fearful, sometimes resentful, were translated into neat, abbreviated Latin. Their lives and livelihoods reduced to columns of figures. The scratch of the quill was the sound of possession being made permanent, of chaos being transformed into administrable data. It was an inventory of a subdued, sleeping land, a detailed lullaby of ownerships sung in dry, economic terms. Each manor, each swine, each acre of rye was noted, not for its beauty or its history, but for its value to the crown. The survey was the ultimate expression of the Norman mind. If it could be counted, it could be controlled. As dusk began to pool in the valleys, turning the distant river to a ribbon of lead, William finally turned from the battlements. The first lights of the Saxon village twinkled faintly in the gathering gloom, small and defiant, or perhaps merely resigned. They were now entries in a book, their future circumscribed by the figures on a page. His shadow vanished as he moved toward the timber steps, leading down to the hall, but its essence remained, cast across the entire realm. It was the shadow of the motte itself, of the castle that would soon be stone, of the law that was now written in a foreign tongue, and of the quiet, relentless scribe in the corner, whose pen, by the light of a single candle, was quietly, meticulously drawing a new map of England, one measured hide at a time. The conquest had been won with the sword, but it would be secured with the pen, and the land, in its twilight sleep, was being dreamt into a new and lasting order. The old monk's world had once been made of wood. He remembered the church of his youth, a humble structure of oak and thatch that had stood on this very spot. Its walls had breathed with the seasons, swelling in the damp and contracting in the dry, its timbers singing softly in the wind. The air inside had been warm with the scent of humanity, of damp wool, of beeswax candles, of the earthy incense of packed soil underfoot. The light had been gentle, filtering through oiled parchment windows, a honeyed glow that seemed an extension of the hearth light from the village. It was a living, whispering space, intimate as a hall, where the prayers felt like conversations murmured into the grain of the posts. That church was gone now, dismantled with reverence, its timber repurposed for barns and byres. In its place, something impossible was rising. From his customary seat on a weathered bench near the cloister garden, the old monk listened. The sound that defined this new age was not the whisper of wind in thatch, but the endless rhythmic percussion of chisel on stone. It was a dry, sharp music that began at dawn and continued until the light failed. A heartbeat of ambition. Tap, tap, a staccato rhythm from the mason's yard where ashlar blocks were squared. Tap, 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 a slower, more considered beat from within the rising walls where carvers worked on capitals. The sounds layered upon one another, a percussive symphony of creation punctuated by the distant shout of a master mason and the grating rumble of a sled loaded with cornstone being dragged across the timber causeway. To the old monk it was the sound of a new world being quarried from the bones of the old, a world of geometry and permanence that both awed and chilled him. He would lift his eyes, his neck stiff with years, to follow the lattice of scaffolding that clung to the half-built walls. Against the vast canvas of the English sky, the scaffolds were a delicate skeletal web, a temporary forest of lashed poles and planked walkways where men moved like ants. They were silhouettes against the clouds, hauling baskets of mortar on their shoulders, adjusting pulley systems, their movements small and precise, within the monumental scale of their endeavour. The nave was rising. A canyon of pale stone opened to the heavens, its round arches, repeated with a relentless marching rhythm, framed squares of sky that changed from dove grey to cerulean to the bruised purple of twilight. The columns were thick as ancient oaks, but where oak had grain and life, these were smooth, cold cylinders, their surfaces still marked with the mason's drag line, waiting for the final smoothing. The air within this stone shell was different, colder, sharper, carrying the dust of limestone and the damp smell of fresh mortar. It smelled of the earth's depths, not its surface. The awe he felt was a quiet, humbling pressure in his chest. When the choir sang the offices now, their voices did not warn the wood. They soared up into the stone vault, echoing, multiplying, becoming something less human and more angelic. The scale was not human. It was built to diminish the individual, to direct the gaze and the soul upward on sunny days, when the light fell through the temporary gaps where great windows would one day be. It cut sharp, brilliant shafts through the interior dust, illuminating floating motes and making the stone gleam like bone. It was beautiful, but its beauty was severe, an intellectual and spiritual beauty that spoke of a God of order and power, a far cry from the gentle, familiar God of the wooden church, who had felt close enough to touch in the smoke of the candle. He remembered the warmth of the old timber, the way it had absorbed the summer heat and radiated it back in winter. This stone would always be cold. It would hold the chill of the earth within it, a constant sobering reminder of the tomb from which faith promised resurrection. The Norman master mason, a man of few words and many lines on parchment, spoke of proportions, of load-bearing, of the triumph of the rounded arch. The old monk listened, understanding little of the mathematics, but feeling the intent. This was not just a larger church. It was a different language of belief altogether. It was a prayer made manifest in volume and void, in light and shadow, in the crushing weight of stone, engineered to seem weightless as it climbed. As the years of his life dwindled, the cathedral grew. Each time he looked, another arch was complete, another section of vaulting closed. The scaffolding crept ever skyward, a temporary ladder toward heaven. The rhythmic tapping was the soundtrack of his old age, a constant reminder of the relentless forward march of time and faith. He knew he would not live to see the towers crowned, to see the lead laid on the roof, to witness the installation of the stained glass that would transform this canyon of stone into a lantern of colored light. But that was fitting. His world had been of wood, warm and transient. This new world was of stone, cold and eternal. In the cool, echoing nave, amidst the dust and the din of construction, the old monk felt a profound peace. He was a bridge between two ages, a living memory of a simpler faith, watching with quiet wonder as the stones block by block, chisel tap by chisel tap, climbed towards a heaven that seemed, in this new magnificent scale, both farther away and more astonishingly reachable than ever before. Dawn at Runnymede was a slow, damp unveiling. The Thames, broad and placid here, lay under a blanket of mist so thick it seemed a second. Slow a river flowing just above the first. The water meadows on its southern bank were a world of muted greens and silvers. The long grass and sedge heavy with dew that soaked the boots of men, and the fetlocks of horses alike. The air was cool and still, carrying the rich, peaty scent of wet earth and the faint, sweet decay of river plants. It was a place of ancient neutral ground, a liminal space between the king's fortress upstream and the baron's power downstream, chosen for its very emptiness, its lack of memory. On this morning, the 15th of June, the meadow held its breath, the mist swallowing sound and softening intense, making the gathering of men and tents seem like a phantom camp materializing from the fog. The quiet was profound, but it was not peaceful. It was a silence thick with unspoken words, attention held in the set of a shoulder, in the way a man glanced toward the royal pavilion before looking quickly away. Knights and barons stood in small, murmuring clusters, their breath pluming in the chill air. Their fine tunics of wool and silk were darkened at the hem by the wet grass, their splendour humbled by the insistent damp of England. They spoke in low tones, their Latin legalese and Norman French forming a soft, anxious buzz that was absorbed by the mist. There were no grand speeches, no declarations to the heavens. The negotiations had happened elsewhere, in heated chambers and through gritted teeth. This was the day of inscription, of making real on parchment what had been wrought in threat and stalemate. The atmosphere was one of weary, watchful truce, a fragile equilibrium as delicate as the spider webs beaded with moisture in the rushes. At the centre of the meadow, a space had been cleared. A large trestle table had been carried out and set upon the uneven ground, its planks already darkening with damp. Around it, clerks and bishops gathered, their robes practical and sombre. The most important sound in all of Runnymede that morning was not a voice, but a scratch. It was the dry, precise scratch of a quill's nib on parchment, a sound as small and focused as a heartbeat. The scribe, his hand steady despite the chill, bent over the great sheet of vellum. His pen moved with deliberate care, forming the neat, cursive letters of the Latin text. Each word was a measured compromise, each clause a carefully balanced weight. Sietes knows, know that we. The ink, black and permanent, flowed onto the prepared sheepskin, capturing promises about scutage and inheritance, about the freedom of the church and the liberties of London, about the right to justice and the limits of a king's whim. The document was not born of idealism, but of exhaustion and hard necessity. Yet, as the words accumulated line by line, they began to take on a weight of their own. The mist began to thin as the morning aged, turning from a solid wall to drifting, luminous tendrils that revealed glimpses of the surrounding willows and the distant, gentle hills. The light became a soft, diffuse gold, painting the meadow in a serene, almost holy glow. The act of signing, when it came, was an anticlimax. King John, his face a mask of controlled resentment, applied his seal, the Great Seal of England, a disc of wax impressed with the image of royal authority, to the dangling cords. The barons and bishops followed in turn. There were no flourishes, no pronouncements. It was an administrative ritual, a solemn shaking of hands conducted through wax and parchment. The document itself, this Magna Carta, lay on the table, a physical object, still damp with the meadow's breath. It was not a sword raised in victory, nor a crown placed on a head. It was a list, a contract, a practical attempt to bind the future. And then it was done. The men began to disperse, mounting horses, giving quiet orders to pack tents. The mist had burned away entirely, revealing a wide blue June sky. The meadow returned to its birds and its insects, the rushes swaying gently in a new, warm breeze. The table was carried away, leaving only a trampled patch of grass. But something lingered in the air, something more than the smell of mud and horse. The charter was not a political act in that moment. It was a promise, whispered not in a hall of state, but into the foggy, common English air. It was a fragile idea, planted in the damp soil of a river meadow, a seed of law that claimed even a king was not above the land's ancient, slow justice. The parchment would be copied, sent to cathedrals and sheriffs, disputed revoked, and reissued. Its immediate power would falter, but the whisper remained, caught in the rustle of the reeds and the flow of the Thames, a faint, persistent echo of a notion that would centuries hence be mistaken for a shout. At Runnymede, under the wide sky, they had not forged a nation's destiny. They had simply written down a promise and left it for the river and the rain and the long, patient memory of the land to decide what it might grow into. High in the triforium gallery of the cathedral, where the air was cool and carried the faint, dry scent of stone dust, the world was reduced to geometry and light. The great nave stretched below, a canyon of pale rib-vaulted stone, its immense length leading the eye toward the distant, glittering spark of the high altar. But here, at this elevated remove, the narrative of the day was not one of prayer, but of quiet observation. A narrow arched window, open to the summer morning, framed a living portrait of the town, a bustling, humming organism, seen from a peaceful, godlike height. The sounds that rose were softened by distance, a gentle cacophony of commerce and craft that blended with the echoing plainsong from the choir far below into a single harmonious murmur. Through the window the town was a tapestry of warm, weathered tone. The roofs were a patchwork of mossy thatch, red clay tile, and grey slate, sloping at 100 different angles around the solid, square bulk of the guild halls and the taller, half-timbered houses of the wealthy merchants. Streets, narrow as cracks, wound between them, filled with a slow, constant flow of movement. From this height, the people were not individuals, but parts of a pattern, dark, ant-like dots, processing along the thoroughfares, gathering in clots at market squares, flowing in and out of the dark mouths of alleyways. The river, a ribbon of quicksilver, curved through the scene, its surface broken by the shadows of 3 stone bridges and dotted with the flat-bottomed barges that were the town's lifeline. It was a view of ordered, purposeful industry, a testament to the century of peace and growth that had followed the old, grim struggles. Inside the cathedral, a different kind of industry was on display. One of pure, transcendent light. The morning sun, climbing in the east, began to strike the great stained glass windows of the clerestory. For a long, silent moment, nothing happened. Then, as the angle sharpened, the windows ignited. A shaft of sunlight, raw and white, pierced the thick, coloured glass of a lancet, depicting the martyrdom of a saint. The glass transformed it, breaking it into a spectrum of luminous jewels, a pool of deep, ruby red, the colour of wine and royalty, spilled across the flagstones of the north aisle. Beside it, from a neighbouring panel of azure and cobalt, a lake of cool, celestial blue washed over the base of a pillar. Emerald green, from a scene of Eden, dappled the back of a wooden pew. The light did not rest. It moved with the imperceptible drift of the sun, the coloured patches sliding with glacial slowness across the stone floor, merging and separating in silent, kaleidoscopic ballet. They painted the grey stone with slow-moving visions of paradise, a daily silent miracle that went largely unnoticed by the townsfolk below, who were busy with the earthly paradise of trade, Their quiet industry was its own form of devotion. In the quarter near the river, the Dyers' Guild was at work. From the chimney of a long, low workshop, a thin, peculiar smoke issued, not grey, but a faint, acrid yellow from the weld plant, or a billow of deeper blue from the vats of woad. Behind shuttered windows, men stirred vast steaming pots with long paddles, their arms stained to the elbow in vibrant, unnatural hues. The cloth, once dried, would hang in great, brilliant banners from tenter frames in nearby fields. A secular stained glass of saffron, madder and kermes, not far away. The rhythmic, syncopated thud of fulling hammers echoed from another shed, beating raw woolen cloth into a dense, weatherproof felt. The sound a steady, earthy heartbeat beneath the lighter noises of the street. In the market square, the gentle clamour was a music of prosperity. The calls of the stall-holders were not shouts, but practised, melodic announcements. A spicer, his booth a treasure chest of small, fragrant sacks, measured out pepper and nutmeg with tiny brass weights on a delicate scale. A goldsmith, under a canopy of fine cloth, bent over a necklace, his magnifying lens, a single gleaming eye as he set a minuscule pearl. A line of country folk sold cheeses, eggs, and bundles of herbs, their faces weathered and calm. Transactions were made with the soft plink of silver pennies and the rustle of parchment receipts. There was a dignity to it all, a sense of place and purpose. Each guildsman, each merchant, each apprentice was a thread in the social fabric, their labour contributing to the whole as surely as the mason's labour had built the stone vault soaring above them. The cathedral watched over it all, not as a stern judge, but as a benevolent, silent parent. Its shadow at midday, a cool blessing on the cobbled streets. As the sun reached its zenith, the interior of the cathedral transformed. The coloured light from the windows fell in perfect, steeply angled shafts, now pooling directly beneath their sources. The ruby, azure, and emerald patches intensified, becoming almost liquid in their brilliance. For a brief magical hour, the stone floor was a mosaic of light, a celestial map laid over the earthly nave. A monk passing through on his way to the scriptorium paused, his sandaled feet standing in a puddle of sapphire that made his grey habit seem touched by heaven. Then, slowly, the light began to soften, the colours deepening toward dusk. The bustle in the town outside gradually quieted. The market packed away, the workshop shutters were drawn. The sounds faded to the occasional bark of a dog, the call of a watchman, the distant song of a maid drawing water from the well. From the high gallery, the final act was observed in silence. The sun dipped below the roofline of the western guild halls. The brilliant pools of colour on the cathedral floor faded, leaching away first from the stones, then from the very air, until only the memory of their glory remained. The town below became a pattern of tiny flickering points as candles and hearth fires were lit in 100 windows, a terrestrial echo of the emerging stars. The great stone building, now a cavern of cool gathering shadow, seemed to settle into itself, its day's work of inspiration done, It had watched over the quiet industry of its people, and they, in their turn, had built world worthy of its gaze. The glass had told its stories in light. The stone had provided the eternal frame, and in the streets between, the humble, persistent work of hands had woven the tapestry of a living, breathing age. The horror arrived, not with a scream, but with an absence of sound. It came in the holds of merchant cogs from Gascony, in the bundles of wool from Flanders, a passenger too small to see, riding the summer winds in the well-worn trade routes. There were whispers first having the time, Nile, in the ports, strange tales of a pestilence in the east that left bodies blackened and swollen. But the sea lanes were busy, the markets hungry, and life in its bustling certainty dismissed the rumours as phantoms from a distant world. Then, in a Dorset fishing village, a fisherman's wife fell ill after unpacking a bolt of damp cloth. Her fever was sudden, her skin blooming with dark, roseate marks. She was dead in 3 days. And then her children, and then the neighbour who had come to sit with her. The silence began there, not as peace, but as a slow, creeping cessation. It moved up the drovers' roads and along the river valleys, a terrible, invisible tide. In a village in the Midlands, the horror was never seen, only inferred from the quiet that settled over the lanes. The morning had dawned with its usual sounds, the crow of a cock, the lowing of cows waiting to be milked, the slap of a door as a good wife began her day. By noon, an unnatural hush had fallen. The cows lowed again, their udders full and aching, but no one came. A door in a row of wattle and daub cottages swung lazily on its leather hinge, pushed by a listless breeze. Through the open doorway, a table could be seen, set with a wooden bowl and a horn spoon, as if for a meal that would never be eaten. Further down the lane, another door stood open, and another. The wind, smelling of ripe hay and meadowsweet, wandered through the empty homes, stirring the rushes on the floor. It was a beautiful, sunny day, and the only movement was the dance of dust motes in the slants of light and the slow, rhythmic creak of the unoiled hinges, a lonely metronome counting out the missing heartbeats of the place. The village green, usually a scene of children's games and gossip, was deserted. The communal well, its bucket still hanging from the crank, stood in solemn silence. In the marketplace, where stalls should have displayed autumn apples and fresh-caught pike, there was only trampled earth and a few scattered, forgotten wares. A single wooden cup, a torn strip of leather, and there, in the very centre of the abandoned space, where feet had trodden the ground hardest, a single poppy had taken root. Its petals were a shocking, vibrant scarlet, a defiant speck of life in the expanse of dusty brown. It nodded gently in the breeze, a tiny, oblivious flag of beauty planted in the field of the dead. The horror was in the contrast, the cheerful flower, the bright sky, the sweet air, and the utter, complete human emptiness. The plague had not ravaged. It had simply erased. In a monastery nestled in a remote river valley, the silence was different. It was a conscious, weighted quiet, thick with prayer and the memory of sound. Here, the pestilence had swept through like a scythe, leaving only a handful of survivors. Among them was an old lay brother named Cuthbert. He had watched the brothers fall, one after another, their chant dying in their throats, their bodies laid in a long, terrible row in the chapter house before the ground could be opened for them. The bell for the offices no longer rang. The scriptorium was empty, the unfinished page of a psalter left on a desk, the ink long dried on the pen. The only sounds now were the wind in the cloister, the call of a rook, and the soft, regular scrape of Cuthbert's spade. He worked in the monastery's kitchen garden, a plot once meticulously tended by a dozen hands. Now weeds were beginning to venture into the orderly rows. Cuthbert moved slowly, his back aching, his movements those of a man performing a ritual whose meaning had deepened beyond all words. He was not planting for the harvest. He doubted he would live to see it. He was planting because it was the next thing to do. He pressed a wrinkled pea into the dark, friable soil, covering it with a tenderness that was akin to a burial. Each seed was a tiny act of faith, a whisper against the void. His gnarled hands, which had lifted the bodies of his friends, now cradled the brown onion said. The quiet, profound grief he carried was not expressed in tears, but in the precise depth of the hole he dug, in the firmness with which he tamped the earth around a lettuce seedling. This simple, ancient act of nurturing life was his last prayer, his sole rebuttal to the indiscriminate harvest that had been reaped. In the tending of this small green plot, he was holding on to the world, stitch by fragile stitch, against the unraveling silence. The breath of life had become a silent breath, held in the chest of the land, but here, in the turned soil and the promise of a seed, it waited, fragile and enduring, for the moment it might be released again. The ship became a ghost in the mist before it had truly left the bay. One moment it was a solid shape of tarred oak and patched sail, the men upon its deck still waving, their shouts thin and brave across the water. The next, a tendril of sea fog, cold and grey as a sword blade, curled between the vessel and the shore. The ship blurred, its edges softening, its colours leaching into the universal pearl. Then it was gone, swallowed whole by the silent drifting wall. The woman on the headland kept her hand raised for a long time, her eyes fixed on the empty space where the hull had been, as if her gaze alone could hold the memory of its form against the blankness. The only sound was the sunken sigh of the tide on the shingle below, and the distant forlorn cry of a gull. The war, for her, began not with a trumpet, but with that quiet vanishing. Years passed, measured not in seasons, but in the slow accumulation of absence. In the cottage by the shore, the space at the trestle table where her husband had sat remained empty. She did not set a place there, but neither did she move the bench. It stayed pushed in, a silent monument to a missing presence. The ache was not a sharp pain, but a constant, low pressure, like the dull throb of an old wound in changing weather. She learned to move around it, to set her bowl at the opposite end, to glance at the empty spot only from the corner of her eye. The house held his shadow in the worn smoothness of a tool handle on a shelf, in the particular draught that whistled through a crack he had always meant to fix. The wall was the dust on those unused tools, and the way the firelight, dancing on the wall at night, sometimes seemed to shape the outline of a seated man who was not there. Her solace was the loom. It stood in the corner by the one good window, a sturdy, upright frame of ashwood. Each morning, after the few necessary chores, she would sit on the hard stool, her back straight, and begin. The rhythmic clack of the heddles and the beat of the baton became the substitute for a heartbeat in the too quiet house. Back and forth she threw the shuttle, a little boat of yarn sailing through the grey warp. The fabric grew, tight, plain weave of undyed wool, the colour of fog and sheep. The repetitive motion was a prayer without words, a tactile mantra that filled the hours and stilled the thinking part of her mind in the loom's rhythm. She could almost forget the vast silent distance that stretched from her cottage to the fields of France, a distance measured in the countless throws of the shuttle. The cloth she wove was for no one. It piled in a chest, a tangible record of time spent waiting, each inch representing a day of listening for news that never came. The war itself was a faint rumour, a story told with other people's mouths. It arrived in fragments, carried by peddlers with bad teeth or friars on pilgrimage. They spoke of places with strange slippery names, Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt, as if they were villages in a frightening fairy tale. They told of great victories, of English longbows darkening the sky, of kings ransomed for chests of gold. The woman would listen, her hands never ceasing their work, nodding politely. The tales seemed unreal, fantastical, happening on a different planet from the one, where she drew water from the well and mended the thatch. The victories felt like stones dropped into a deep, still pond. The ripples that eventually reached her shore were too faint to change the temperature of the air, too distant to fill the empty space at her table. The war was not battles or glory. It was the quiet subtraction of a man from a landscape, the slow leaching of hope from a daily routine. Sometimes, on clear evenings, she would walk back to the headland. She would look out over the sea, now calm and glittering in the sunset, or iron grey and choppy under a stormy sky. She watched for sails, though she knew, in the part of her that had grown wise and weary, that the ship she awaited would not return this way. The war had taken him into its long, slow moor, and the distance was too great, the time too stretched. The quiet ache settled into her bones, a companion as familiar as the salt wind. It was the ache of a story left unfinished, of a life suspended in the cold, salt air between the clack of the loom and the sigh of the tide. A single, enduring note of loneliness held for 100 years. The fire in the hearth was a small, drowsy sun, its light lapping gently at the worn stones and the bowed legs of an oaken stool. Upon that stool sat the archer, or the man who had been won. His hands, resting on his knees, were a map of old labour, knuckles swollen and skewed like ancient tree roots, palms cross-hatched with scars that were pale and smooth as river stones. They lay utterly still. The longbow that had once been an extension of his sinews, that had thrummed with the tension of 100 flights, now stood retired in a shadowed corner, its yew-stave collecting a soft grey fur of dust. He did not look at it. His gaze was turned inward, fixed on the gentle, crumbling landscapes of memory. where the long war existed not as history, but as weather. He remembered the smell of French earth, not the iron and mud stench of the battlefield, which was a brief, terrible punctuation, but the deep, permanent scent of the land itself. It was different from the damp, grassy smell of his Sussex downland. This was a drier, more aromatic soil, smelling of hot stone and wild thyme after rain, of sun-baked clay, and the dusty sweetness of vineyards in late summer. He had noticed it first while lying in a ditch at dawn, his cheek pressed to the ground, waiting for a mist to lift. That smell had seeped into him, a quiet, persistent fact of a foreign world. It was the smell of a place that did not care who claimed its lordship, a patient, breathing entity that would outlast all kings and their quarrels. The memories were soft, faded tapestries where the figures had blurred, leaving only the background textures and tones. He recalled the sound of rain on his waxed hood during a long watch, a steady drumming patter that isolated him in a cocoon of noise, making the world beyond his shoulders shrink to the size of that sound. He remembered the weight of the longbow, not in the moment of drawing, but in the long marches, the familiar, vertical pressure against his shoulder, the grip of his hand on the smooth belly of the stave. A constant, companionable burden. He remembered the feel of the hempen bowstring, endlessly checked for fraying with calloused thumbs, and the particular feathered kiss of an arrow's nock as he set it. These were the sensations that had filled the vast empty spaces between the moments of terror, the mundane liturgy of a soldier's life. What had faded almost entirely were the faces of the men beside him. He knew they had been there. Loud Wart from Kent, Silent John from Yorkshire. But their features had dissolved, leaving only impressions of a shared breath in the cold, a shoulder brushing his in a crowded formation, a muffled curse in the dark. The battles themselves were not narratives, but collections of physical impressions. The jarring shock up his arm as a bodkin point struck plate at close range. The surreal, slow-motion arc of a fire arrow against a twilight sky. The unbelievable, stoil slow-motion arc of a fire arrow against a twilight sky. Breathless silence that could follow the whistle of a volley. A heartbeat of pure void before the chaos answered. Even these sharp fragments were now worn smooth, their edges rounded by the relentless river. Years, becoming less like memories and more like stones, he had carried in his pocket for a lifetime, their origins forgotten, only their weight and smoothness remaining. Now, in the peaceful weariness of age, it had all dissolved into a kind of atmospheric nostalgia. The long war was a season of his youth, a period of heightened sensation and profound weariness, now viewed across a gulf of quiet decades. The pride and the pain had burned down to the same cool ash. He felt no hatred for the Frenchman in the opposite ditch, only a vague, distant kinship. They had both been cold, hungry, and afraid. Actors in a play whose plot was written by distant men in fine tents, the cause for which he had fought, the rights of kings and the claims of thrones, seemed as distant and theoretical as the movements of the stars. What was real was the memory of the sun on his neck during a summer march, the taste of sour wine from a looted farmhouse, the ache in his muscles at the end of a day. The fire settled with a soft sigh, a log collapsing into a nest of glowing embers. The movement stirred him from his reverie. He shifted slightly on the stool, a faint creak of wood and bone. Outside, a gentle English rain had begun to fall, tapping on the thatch with a sound both familiar and eternal. He listened to it, and for a moment, the sound merged with the memory of rain on a French field, blurring the decades and the miles. There was no difference now. It was all just weather. Just the sound of water on the world, just the quiet, patient rhythm that had been there before the banners were raised, and would be there long after the last veteran's memory had guttered out. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to feel the warmth of the fire on his lids, to listen to the rain, to inhabit fully the mind's simple, profound peace of a man who has outlived his wars and whose only remaining duty is to remember, softly, until even that fades into the gentle, forgiving dark. In a sun-drenched garden of a southern manor, a white rose bloomed against a warm stone wall. Its petals were the purest ivory, unfolding in perfect concentric layers, each one soft as parchment and cool to the touch. The morning sun, filtering through a canopy of apple trees, dappled the blossom with light, making it seem to glow from within. A single bee, heavy with pollen, hummed lazily around its heart, a tiny golden mote in the still air. The rose was a symbol of a claim, of a lineage that traced itself back to the lion-hearted Edward. But here, in this quiet corner, it was simply a flower, its thorns hidden by lush green foliage, its beauty an unthinking gift of the summer. The garden was a world of order and peace, herb beds laid out in neat squares, a fish pond reflecting the sky, the distant contented cluck of hens from the yard. The white rose belonged to this serene sunlit certainty. In a candlelit hall far to the north, a red rose stood in a silver vase upon a heavy oak table. Its crimson was deep and velvety, the colour of wine and of heart's blood, seeming to absorb the flickering light from the tallow dips rather than reflect it. The hall was high-ceilinged and shadowy, the stone walls hung with tapestries that depicted scenes of hunting and heraldry, their threads muted in the gloom. A fire smouldered in the great hearth, but its warmth did not reach the room's corners. The red rose was a stark, vivid punctuation in the dimness, a declaration. It spoke of a rival claim, of a lineage just as proud, forged in the marches of Wales and the dales of Yorkshire. Here, the rose was not part of garden, but an ornament of state, its placement deliberate, its colour a silent, potent challenge in the quiet of the evening. The air smelled of wood smoke, old rushes, and the faint metallic scent of polished armour leaning in an alcove. Between these two symbols, in the rolling wooded country of the Midlands, lay the fortified manor of a minor lord, loyal to neither York nor Lancaster, but to the fragile idea of peace. The house was a modest stone box with a timber-framed hall, surrounded by a ditch and a palisade of sharpened stakes. Its life was quiet, anxious, and inward-looking. The lady of the house, a woman whose youth had been spent in the prosperous calm before, now moved through her days with a listening air. She would pause while directing the salting of meat in the cool pantry, her head tilted, as if trying to catch a sound beyond the thick walls. She would stand at the narrow window of the solar, her eyes scanning the distant road, where it emerged from a line of oaks, watching not for guests, but for dust. The children, sensing the unspoken tension, played quieter games in the courtyard, their laughter often dying abruptly when a horseman was spotted on the track, only to resume when he was identified as a harmless peddler or a friar. News came in frequently, and always as rumour. It arrived with a travelling chapman, his pack light on gossip, or with a kinsman from a nearby market town, his face grim beneath the brim of his hat. The news was never clear, always fragmentary, a collection of half-understood names and places. They spoke of a skirmish at a place called Blore Heath, of a confrontation at Ludford Bridge. The details were vague. Who had won, what it meant, but the fact of the violence was a stone dropped into the deep well of their security. The Lord would retreat to his small study after such tidings, staring at a map he could not really comprehend, tracing lines between places he had never seen. The clashes were like far-off thunder on a still summer day. You felt the vibration in the air long before you heard the sound, a deep, unsettling tremor that promised a storm without revealing its direction or its fury. At night, the anxiety grew teeth. The manor's gates were barred an hour earlier than custom dictated. The watchman on the palisade walk was doubled, though the men were farmers, not soldiers, their hands more accustomed to plough handles than pike staves. From the bedchamber the lady would lie awake, listening to the ordinary sounds of the night, the creak of timber, the call of an owl, and interpreting each as a signal of approaching doom. The distant clashes of the roses were not just political events. They were the slow unravelling of a world where a minor lord's title and his walls were enough to guarantee safety. Now the very symbols of power had become weapons, and the quiet life behind the palisade felt as fragile as the parchment on which those rival claims were written. The white rose in the sun and the red rose in the candlelight were not just emblems. They were the poles between which the realm was tearing itself apart, and the thunder, though still distant, was rolling inexorably closer. The sun, low and swollen, hung over the field of Bosworth like a great burnished coin. It painted the scene in tones of dying glory, a burnished gold that gilded the tops of the trampled wheat stalks, and a deep, sorrowful crimson that pooled in the hollows and ditches. The battle was over. The last clang of sword on shield, the last shouted oath, the last drumbeat of hooves had faded into the immense, settling quiet of late afternoon. The field was not a scene of grand carnage from this gentle vantage, but a landscape altered by weariness. The earth was churned to a thick, dark paste in places, studded with the discarded detritus of ambition. A broken lance shaft, a dented sallet with its visor torn away, a water skin leaking its last drops onto the mud. The air, once tight with the shriek of arrows and the roar of men, now held only the whisper of a faint cooling breeze and the distant, lonely cry of a carrion crow circling high on the thermal currents. In the center of the field, where the press had been fiercest, a single banner stirred. It was not held aloft by any herald, but lay half-trodden into the mire. Its pole snapped. The fabric was a rich, deep blue, embroidered with a device now obscured by dirt and a dark, damp stain. The breeze, as if with a respectful hand, lifted one corner of the silk, making it flutter with a soft, hopeless sound, like the last sigh of a great beast. It was the only movement in the tableau. The men were gone, the victors pursuing, the vanquished fled or captured, the dead being gathered by slow, solemn parties who moved like shadows in the golden light. The banner's lonely stirring was the era's final, feeble gesture, a symbol of all the proud standards that had risen and fallen for 30 bloody years, now discarded and forgotten in a Leicestershire field. The narrative began to pull back, slowly, like a slow camera rise from the ground. The perspective lifted above the banner, above the broken hedgerows and the trampled crops, revealing the field as a mere patch of disturbed earth in the vast quilted countryside, forests of oak and ash, their greens deepening toward twilight, surrounded the scene, ancient and unmoved.